What's up, my brother?
My man,
How
we
you
got
doing?
good. We got Dubs Kings tonight. So
I know. I'm looking forward to that.
strap in.
I am unfortunately, or maybe somewhat fortunately, going to be at a elementary school fundraiser tonight, but I'm going to have my phone with me and watching the game, watching the score. The fundraiser is going to be at a local bar, and it's college night. And there's apparently going to be beer pong,
Wow.
which I
What is
haven't
it?
played for quite some time.
That's what's gonna be my and also as a Dartmouth guy, isn't it like a sacrilege to not refer to it as Beirut?
It is actually, but I'm gonna lose that fight. And speaking of Beirut, we're gonna be back in the neighborhood of the Middle East for this
Nice. Hey,
version.
love the segue.
Yeah, pretty good, pretty smooth for this version of Global Tantrum with Stephen Galen. And let's see, last week we were in Eastern Europe, Ukraine. Events have transpired there. We'll get back to that at some point. But
Sure have.
this week we are talking about Iran and what's going on with Iran and whether Iran may be about to go nuclear. Galen?
Yeah, that is, I would argue, the top question among the high-level national security folks looking at the Middle East at the moment, as it has been for nearly 2 decades, more than two.
More than 2 decades.
I remember my first time being a TA in grad school in 2010. Is that right? 2011?
The bad old days.
Yeah. This was one of the big topics in the IR classes we were teaching.
Yeah, security studies.
Yeah. And like some things have changed, some details have changed, but the overall structure of the debate is in many ways pretty similar.
It's a will they or won't they debate. And conditions, yeah, on the ground from a high level, basically the same. One condition that has changed is Iran is now much, much closer to being able to make a bomb. Back then, we were talking in years. Now we're talking in weeks to months, right, Galen?
So if it comes to getting the fissile material, the enriched uranium at bomb grade, which is 90%, Iran has enriched up to about 60%, which is a hop, skip, and a jump away from bomb grade. It might sound like a big step to go from 60 to 90, but I guess the analogy nuclear engineers have given me is if you're separating out two different color marbles in a bag, once you've picked out most of them, it gets easier and easier to go more quickly. So they've done the vast majority of the work and they could have bomb grade uranium. The estimates I've seen are like 10 to 14 days.
Yeah.
So like easily by spring break, if they wanted to do that.
They heat up spring break
Yeah,
to thermonuclear temperature.
Yes.
Okay. And we're talking about this now because there's been some reporting, not a lot of reporting, given everything else that's going on in the world right now, but some reporting basically highlighting that the Israelis, now that they're at least temporarily done with the Gaza war, trashing Hezbollah, destroying Syria's army, striking the Houthis and everything else, are turning their attention to Iran's nuclear program and asking themselves the question, is it time to resolve this once and for all at the point of a bunker busting bomb?
So just to clarify, like the time is not quite as tight as the 2 weeks because that's to get the fissile material, which is the biggest step. But to weaponize could take them up to a year by some estimates if they wanted to have bombs suitable to be put on warheads that could be put on ballistic missiles, maybe 6 months if they want crude weapons. So either way, we're talking about events that at the latest could be like the end of the summer, depending on which pathway they go. And then the key point is the one you raised, Steve, which the Wall Street Journal reported earlier this month that the outgoing Biden administration had basically assessed that the Israelis were once again looking very seriously, not for the first time, but for the first time in a while, looking this seriously at going for it. Their defense minister, Israel Katz, said in November, Iran is more exposed than ever to strikes on its nuclear facilities. We have the opportunity to achieve our most important goal to thwart and eliminate the existential threats to the state of Israel. Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, has referred to Iran as an octopus that has its arms all over the region, and that the Israelis should strike the head of the octopus while they have it on the run, while its allies in Hezbollah and Hamas are weak. So
The head of the octopus. I like that.
yes,
They've chopped off some arms for sure and scared
correct.
the octopus. But when you scare an octopus, one of the things it does is shoot ink, right?
I don't know. Is that true? I thought that was squids.
Oh, yeah, maybe octopi are smart. I don't know. I've been reading a book on octopus intelligence, actually, and it's fascinating. But
That makes one of us.
yeah, maybe a topic for another show.
Yeah.
Anyway, all of this to say, matters are reaching ahead here because the Israelis do see an opportunity. In particular, they blew up a bunch of Iran's air defenses in strikes late last year. Is that right?
I think it was early October, right?
Yeah. And in a stunning series of strikes, they took out a bunch of air defenses, and the Iranians, as far as we know, haven't replaced those.
I think they also targeted the fuel mixers that fabricates the fuel for their missiles, which take a long time to come back online as well. So a not so subtle, as Netanyahu basically said, we can touch you, you can't touch us.
They can touch them harder next time because they don't need to be as worried about anti-aircraft missiles blowing their planes out of the sky.
Correct. And just for people who might not have learned about this before, or this is the plot of Homeland or whatever, this would not be the first time, certainly not the first time the Israelis have thought about doing this and talked to the United States about it. The the air traffic between Washington and Jerusalem in 2010 and 2012 was very, very intense over this issue. Going back to 2008, the Israelis asked the second Bush administration to help give them the arms necessary to be able to strike. And the Israelis, moreover, have done this in to other countries. They famously blew up Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981 in the famous Osirak operation. And in 2007, they blew up Syria's Al-Kabar reactor. So it would not be the first time that the Israelis undertake preventive nuclear strikes.
Yeah, they have some expertise in this area, at least with striking above ground facilities. This would be a different level of enterprise entirely.
Tell me more about that. It seems almost a difference in kind, not in degree.
Yeah. So you're talking about Iraq and whatever the facility, Osirak, excuse me, in Iraq, and whatever the facility in Syria was called. I don't remember. Al-Kabar, thank you. Yeah. And these were relatively straightforward strikes in the sense that the Israelis knew they weren't terribly well defended, and they were able to penetrate and destroy the targets easily. And they also knew that those resources were pretty centralized for those countries. So like that kind of put paid to the Iraqi nuclear program for a while.
They did rebuild it somewhat, and then they had a crash program during the period in between when Saddam invaded Kuwait and then Desert Storm happened. And then after the war, there was discoveries that they had this clandestine program.
Got it. Yeah. And that prior to the Iraq war and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think the Bush administration was thinking about that and wondering whether they were going after it again. And a lot of events unfolded from there with mixed results, shall we say. Anyway.
Mixed would be generous.
Yeah. So if that was swatting mosquitoes, then going after the Iranian nuclear program is trying to get at termites basically underneath a house that is not in easy distance.
So
kind of what I would say.
There's a few things, like the Osirak operation, I don't want to totally downplay, like the distance covered was significant, and Israeli aircraft had to overfly other countries whose airspace, I believe they did not have permission to overfly.
The Jordanians, right? In particular.
But the distances here are much longer.
Yes.
It's multiple sites. Now, depending on how large the operation could be, it could be up to 6 sites if we counted Esfahan, the heavy water reactor at Arak. But the sort of crown jewels of the Iranian nuclear program, the major focus would be the 2 uranium enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz. I feel like you have better operational details as to why striking those 2 is not going to be a piece of cake.
Yeah, I was alluding to termites being dug into the foundation of a house. These sprawling facilities are, by some accounts, 400 feet underground, built into mountains. We are talking about a lot of very dense matter between enemy forces dropping bombs and the ability to penetrate into those bunkers and blow up the good stuff. The good stuff in this case being the extremely delicate high-tech centrifuges that are necessary to do the rest of that enrichment job. Get that uranium up from 60% to bomb grade 90% plus, right, Galen? And yeah, so you need specialized equipment, specialized explosives to be able to do this. And the Israelis do have so-called precision bunker buster bombs right? 2,000-pound bombs, which are pretty big and pretty explosive, pretty precise. The United States sells them to Israel. Israel has used them during the Gaza war and to try to get at the underground tunnels that Hamas uses. They've used them in other strikes elsewhere. They know how to use them and they're good at it. The thing is that these facilities are too hardened and buried too deep, which is not to say that they couldn't try to do it using this type of ordnance. They totally could. And it would require basically digging a hole with multiple precision strikes. So blowing a big hole in the side of a mountain, then hitting that hole with more bombs exactly the right way to expand it and literally digging out the side of the mountain with multiple strikes. So it raises the risks of being able to do this. That's if they use the GBU-28s that they currently have, the 2,000-pound bunker busters. Now, if the United States were to give Israel the Moabs, MOAB, the mother of all
Shout
bombs.
out to Utah.
Yes, Moab, Utah. We're not talking about the national park here. We're talking about the mother of all bombs. These are 30,000-pound conventional munitions. The GBU 58s, I think. Do I have that right? 57s. GBU 57s.
So close.
These are an order of magnitude larger than the bunker busters we've given the Israelis. And we do not, by we, the U.S. military, we don't give these to anybody. We reserve them for our own use. If the Israelis had access to these Moabs, the 30,000-pound big boys, then I think this operation would go from shaky, honestly, in terms of like really cleaning this up the first time and being confident about it, to a much less riskier proposition, basically.
Yeah. I should add, by the way, I think the New York Times, or I can't remember who, someone reported last year that at Fordo, the Iranians were expanding their tunnel network.
Downwards, I would imagine, right?
Correct. And doing more reinforcing with reinforced concrete to further harden. Doing it with the ordnance the Israelis currently have, I'm not in a position to say whether it's completely impossible, but much more challenging, which is why, again, going all the way back to the tail end of the second Bush administration, the Israelis have been trying to get their hands not only on these bunker busters, but on the B-2 bombers that you need to actually carry these. Those are other weapon systems the United States not give out. The article I referred to earlier that was reported in the Wall Street Journal, that one of the reasons the outgoing Biden people assessed the Israelis think this might be a good time is because, like everyone else, they probably assessed that Trump would be much more likely than any of his predecessors to go ahead and approve that type of arms sale, which we have never seen.
Yeah, which we haven't done in the past. And we've had these bunker busters for quite a while, I think decades now. And we sell them the smaller version for sure. And not just them, I think we sell them to other allies too. But this is something that we reserve for ourselves classically. But Trump is doing things differently in many different respects, right? In foreign and domestic policy. So maybe this is a rule that he's willing to change.
He took a super hard line with the Iranians and a super supportive line with the Israelis in his first term. And I see no reason so far to think this term will be any different.
That being said, his initial comments early in his administration and even before he assumed office again were that he was looking for some kind of deal with the Iranians. And he was not necessarily telling them to go kick rocks or threatening them with imminent military action, right? It's actually been the opposite, which is interesting.
So yes, but it's one of those yes, but almost no.
Yeah. What are the terms of the deal that we're talking about?
So this, we should do a little bit of history, whether we need to go all the way back to the Iranian Revolution. I don't know. We can certainly talk about it at some point. But the initial way this was solved, in air quotes, because it was more kick the can down the road, bought some time, albeit a not insignificant amount of time, was when the Obama administration, along with other world powers, China, Russia, I think it was the P5+1, right? Yeah, the one being Germany. So the Europeans negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the worst named agreement ever. A great way to market it. Such a clunky name.
It does not fit in many hip hop songs that I've heard.
Shit, man. So that agreement signed in 2015, like I said, basically bought some time. So what it did was it did a few things. It forced Iran to reduce the number it had by about 2/3
Mm.
for a set period of time. It was either 10 or 15 years. I can't remember which one. Limited the number of more advanced centrifuges, Iran's IR2s, that could be used. I think only till 1,000. They had to continue using the less efficient IR1s. Iran had to ship out 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile. It pledged to only enrich to 3 to 5%, which is what you need to produce electricity like other nuclear power plants do. And it put these facilities under really intrusive inspections. And in exchange, the sanctions, which were multilateral, were lifted. That was basically the deal. If you supported the deal, you basically took the line of, okay, this is not a permanent fix. Some of these provisions sunset in 10 to 15 years, but a lot can happen in 10 to 15 years, and we don't have a lot of other good options at this point. It's either...
I believe the deal is sunsetting fall of this year, which would suggest it was a 10-year deal.
So certain provisions were 10, certain were 15.
Got it. Okay.
And I can't remember off the top of my head which ones were which.
Me either.
But that was the criticism of the deal. One of them, these provisions sunset. We're kicking the can down the road. The other ones were the U.S. tried really hard. I actually was at a talk where Wendy Sherman, who is one of the lead State Department negotiators on this, talked about it, really tried to get part of the deal being that Iran had to give up its ballistic missile program. That was not part of the deal. And nothing about Iran's broader foreign policy behavior, particularly in the Middle East, things like supporting its proxies, things like how it approaches its relations with Israel. Those were deemed outside the deal too far to get. If I understand what Trump is saying right now, he basically wants all of that stuff, plus a final, like, complete solve on the nuclear issue.
Yeah. So a grand bargain or a modus vivendi whereby Iran would abandon its foreign policy, the foreign policy that it's had since the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979, which is to export the revolution to the rest of the Middle East. It's to be inimical towards Israel.
States, right? The great Satan and the little Satan.
The great Satan and the little Satan. That's right. Death to America, death to Israel. It's part of the national creed in Iran still, as far as I know. And really join within a Israeli dominated now framework in the Middle East.
Well, October 7th has thrown a bit of a wrench in, but in terms of in the sense of it's been a good last whatever year for the Israelis militarily, yes, and much
really
less
good
so for the Iranians. That's where things are. Like the Biden people came in saying we're going to try to renegotiate, basically do a JCPOA 2.0.
Right.
The Iranian response was, we had a deal, you guys tore it up.
Trump during his first administration basically reneged on the deal, if I remember correctly.
And so the Iranian response was, maybe we can negotiate, but you're the ones that broke the deal, so you're going to have to make it worth our while.
Yes.
And that was not something Biden was willing to do. So here we are, again, faced with this question, which has been on the table for so long now. We'll probably do another episode on something like Stuxnet, but there's been tons of efforts by the US and Israel to slow Iran's progress, to inflict pain on Iran, whether that's through cyber operations, economic sanctions, things like that.
Assassinations. So if you're an Iranian nuclear scientist, you tend to wake up dead, so to speak. There's been a lot of that.
There was a lot of that, especially around 2010. But then right after Biden was elected, what's the guy's name? Is it Fakhrizadeh? I think that was his name. Basically the Oppenheimer of the Iran nuclear program. The Israelis assassinated him a couple weeks after Biden's election in 2020.
They used a remote controlled machine gun in a car, like the end of Breaking Bad. I don't know if they were inspired by that, because that was an awesome scene from the show, if you ever watched that. But yeah.
Look, if whatever you think of the political issues and the wisdom of doing these things, if you want like a crazy book that you can't believe is nonfiction, Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First, about Israeli special ops. It's just like really crazy what they're able to do.
I will add that to Goodreads. I love that stuff. Okay, so if anything, the Iranians have fewer cards to play now, and the American demands are going to be much harsher this time around. So this can basically go one of two ways, and it's going to go one of two ways pretty quickly, from what I can tell. I think that the administration's attention is focused elsewhere at the moment, from what I can tell. But at some point, relatively soon, the Eye of Sauron, meaning the Trump administration, is going to swing back towards the Iranians and be like, "Okay, are you guys ready to make a deal? Here's the
Yeah,
deal."
we're really nerding out now.
Yeah, no, totally. Everybody should know what kind of show they're watching. I think that's
Yeah,
very important. In case you haven't gotten the message already.
I don't know, like, how many of our, like, to 10 fans are tuning in for the suboptimal basketball analysis.
We got more where that came from. Yeah, especially when the
Uh,
playoffs start, right?
yeah, then I'll probably wanna talk about it more.
Exactly.
I think you're right. I think right now Trump is let's deal with Eastern Europe, and I think Netanyahu, um, unlike with Biden and certainly unlike with Obama or Clinton for that matter, is more willing to go along with what Trump wants for the moment because I think he is confident that Trump will then go along with what he wants later on.
After he probably assumes that whatever negotiating ploy Trump is going to try will fail, which is a
Yeah.
reasonable assumption, and then he's going to get to do what he wants.
I also think some of this stuff is probably linked to the Gaza negotiations as well, at least in the short term. Leaving aside right now which way we think this will go, I do think we should talk about that. I do think it's probably worth discussing a little, and every time I teach a class, I have a student say this. Full disclosure, I used to be in this camp. I no longer am. If you look up my master's thesis, I'm not very proud of it at this point. But there are people who make the case, Iran gets a nuclear weapon, who cares? It's not that big a deal. Other
Yeah.
countries have nuclear weapons. We don't have to go necessarily as far as people
Let's
Kenneth
yeah,
Waltz and say it would be a good thing,
it
but
would be a good thing. Let's interrogate that at least a little bit.
Yeah.
So the Israelis have a nuclear arsenal. They don't talk about it and have never confirmed it, but everybody knows it.
correct.
And through clandestine channels, they've let it be known as well that
It's
they
been
have.
known. The New York Times reported this in like 1970.
Yeah, it's been a while. They have the capability to strike certainly anywhere in the greater Middle East, if not further afield. And they've got plenty of weapons to do it. Suppose the Iranians get a crude weapon. Would the Iranians then go and use it on Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? Does that seem likely? No. It would invite massive retaliation. And look, the Iranians have used a lot of, frankly, irresponsible and genocidal rhetoric towards the Israelis over the years. I remember some Iranian leader talking, maybe it was Ahmadinejad.
It was Ahmadinejad.
Yeah, calling Israel a quote unquote one bomb state. You remember
Oh
that?
no, that was Rafsanjani.
Okay.
That was Rafsanjani, I think in 2001, 2002. The Ahmadinejad quote was, which I'm not interested in like the semantics of the translation stuff, since that became a debate, whether it was wipe off the map or disappear from the pages of history. I interpreted it as meaning the destruction of the state of Israel.
Absolutely.
which
Yeah.
is how most people interpreted it.
Yeah, when you call a country a quote unquote one bomb state, it's pretty clear what you're talking about.
I think
And-
there was also from I think it was Khamenei, the supreme leader, that said Israel's a cancer that needs to be removed.
And this is all of a piece for what these guys have been saying for decades and decades now. It's been an integral part of what they say and do. And so if I'm the Israelis, I obviously don't want to hear that shit. And I don't necessarily want to take the chance on quote unquote stable deterrence, protecting my state, right?
So, okay. So that's, by the way, another key point, which is U.S. officials do not want Iran to get the bomb. All right.
And
Now,
that's just of a piece with the greater efforts towards non-proliferation.
so I was about to say there are people that get this wrong and take it too far with the U.S. has a completely across the board non-proliferation policy. As you and I both know, that's not been the case across the board.
Not exactly.
But by and large, the United States is a country that does not like proliferation, and I would argue has done more than any other single country to hold proliferation down through threats and security guarantees.
Although, with the new administration's foreign policy, we should have a show about this.
We should.
That could be a very interesting change.
I think the South Korea one is the hottest one right now, and I
South
can see that
Korea,
happening.
But you look at what's happening in Europe and NATO, and
Right.
you start to really think about that too.
So you're right that there are scenarios maybe in the not too distant future where we could see. That said, the U.S. and the Israelis and U.S. and Israeli officials themselves say this. They do have disagreements on like urgency. The Israelis live in the neighborhood. They, as you just said, have heard some pretty awful existential threats coming from the Iranian
They've
leadership.
been listening to this shit for 45 years.
Yes, this goes back a long time. Khomeini, the original supreme leader, was made any number of awful anti-Semitic comments. Obviously, Israelis in particular, given the events of the 20th century, would be especially sensitive to these sorts of threats.
And now we have October 7th on top of that.
There is a difference, whereas the United States is the most powerful country in the world. It lives much farther away. Iran currently does not have intercontinental ballistic missiles, so it cannot hit the United States, though it is able to hit a lot of other targets. So there is a difference when it comes to timeline and urgency. But I think the bigger point that's raised here, I agree with you. I don't see Iran doing like a bolt from the blue on Israel with nuclear weapons.
Even if they did, there's no way that they could defeat Israeli second strike capability.
Israel now has nuclear submarines. Israel has been doing this much longer than the Iranians have. Frankly, I'm much more confident in their military capabilities and scientists. That's not necessarily the scenario I'm worried about. I also find it very far-fetched that Iran would give the bomb to a terrorist organization or one of its proxies like Hezbollah. I just don't. The Israelis would find out.
Yes. And if not them, then we would, right?
Correct.
United States.
The list of countries that would have done that would maybe be one. Like, it would be unbelievably risky. That's less the scenario I worry about. The scenarios I and a lot of other people worry about have more to do with if Iran gets the bomb, the Saudis have said they will get the bomb.
Yep.
Whether they do is another question. We've had freakouts about proliferation cascades for decades.
The Saudis have in the past apparently investigated buying nuclear weapons off the shelf from the Pakistanis.
Correct.
There's also the Turks. Let's think about the Turks as well.
I was going to say the Turks, Erdogan, I think, has also said this as well.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think there are still analysts that I think believe that, like, in an emergency, Saudi Arabia has bought access to Pakistani nukes, but I've never been able to confirm that.
I don't think anybody knows one way or the other. There's also the Pakistanis themselves, which we were talking about a little bit prior to the show. This is like a border that a lot of people don't think about.
Look, I'm going to give you your flowers on this one. I remember you bringing this up like over a decade ago, and I had never heard someone make the point at that time, and I don't think I've ever heard someone make the point since. So thanks, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, these guys share a border, the Pakistanis and the Iranians. They're neighbors, unlike the Israelis and the Iranians, which are in the same general vicinity, but thousands of miles away from each other. No, the Pakistanis are right there. They don't necessarily like each other. So the Pakistanis are at various times a military government or Sunni extremist, while the Iranians are a Shia theocracy. And if you know anything about the Sunnis and the Shia, they tend not to get along very well historically.
So there's that. If we're doing the greater Middle East, you could argue that we've already got another nuclear power.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Turkey. Another one is the United Arab Emirates.
Sure. Yep. They're very wealthy and militaristic.
Some people throw the Egyptians in there. I'm a little more skeptical about that one. But like the point being, you could have some reactive proliferation concerns. The biggest concern I have with this whole line of reasoning, which we should do an episode on nuclear strategy.
Yeah.
The reason I think a lot of people intuitively reject the idea that the world would be safer if it were awash in nuclear weapons is that international politics remains political. Like if you're taking the argument that if everyone had nukes, warfare would die out, I think that's taking the politics out of international politics.
There's also the stability and instability paradox.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway.
I mean, look, the reason we almost blew up the planet in 1962 was because there was a fundamental political question related to the fate of Germany that had not been settled. And once that was settled, things really cooled off. Iran and Israel is not a dyad where I'm like, yes, we'll be able to work out the core political issues. Like I maybe couldn't think of two worse countries to have repeated nuclear crises and nuclear contests and risk-taking than Israel and Iran. And so...
Look, the Iranians are not like genetically predisposed to anti-Semitism or anything like that. The Iran under the Shah was a major Israeli ally.
Yeah, and we should say, by the way, the Iranian government today, not terribly popular among Iranian people.
Yes, there's a major distinction there. Yeah,
Yes.
it has not performed very well or delivered the goods for the Iranians or anybody else other than the
Yeah.
Iranian Revolutionary Guard, from what I can tell. But yeah, it's like the United States is awash in personal firearms. Do we think that Americans are safer as a result of that? No, they're not. Personal deterrence fails all the time for various reasons. And we have a sky high murder rate as a result. And that's an imperfect analogy, but I think it's a reasonable one. There have been many documented instances in history where we came a hair's breadth from nuclear war by accident. And you increase the number of states and the number of weapons floating around out there, more opportunities for accident arise. I think it's that simple.
Well, so there's that aspect of it too, which is just hard to argue with. Whether Iran would be a very responsible nuclear custodian, somewhat of an open question. People, since you mentioned Pakistan, people worry about the Pakistani case,
and the North Korean case.
right? State instability, right? North Korea is another one. That's tough to argue with. I'm thinking of political scenarios which are not far fetched. Which leads to nuclear crises where you can get a nuclear war even if no one wants one. And we saw that. We saw those sorts of dangerous threats over Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War. So I'm unconvinced by the argument, hey, we fought a Cold War against the Soviet Union, which was orders of magnitude more powerful than Iran, which is a middle power, and we just had stable deterrence and mutually assured destruction. I think that argument misses the fact that the political issues were largely addressed, and we lived in a world with a status quo that everyone could at least be reasonably, not everyone, but the superpowers could be reasonably satisfied with. I don't see that being the case in the Middle East with the nuclear Iran.
A lot of things would have to change in a more positive direction, and recent changes have taken things in a negative direction, like they've moved further away from stability. So we're further away now from where we would need to be for that type of stable deterrence relationship than I think we've ever been.
And 2 more points, like we now know, I guess, if you're looking for like silver linings of the Iraq war, the United States basically captured the Iraqi archives. So
for an archivist like yourself, that is a silver lining.
So academics were able to look at what was going on. And one thing that was discovered was nuclear program in large part was motivated by the desire, you mentioned the stability instability paradox. In other words, if things are stable at the nuclear level and you've got nuclear checkmate, then that makes it safe to fight a conventional war.
And we've seen this kind of.
That's the case a lot of people like to point to. Yeah. It turns out like that was what Saddam Hussein's thinking was, that he wanted his war with Israel, and for the Arabs to win that war, it had to be and so he needed to offset Israel's nuclear arsenal before he could, I think the quote was something like, let the streets run with blood or something like that. So
nice guy, Saddam.
Yeah, I know. I'm reading a book about him right now. Why? Even worse than I thought.
There's a lot of meat hooks in the palace, if I remember correctly. It's like mob boss stuff, right?
Crazy. So that's not a reassuring precedent.
No.
And the other point to make is if you wanted to prevent other countries in the region from getting the bomb, historically, the way the United States has done that is by offering security guarantees.
Extended deterrence, right?
Yes. Which, aside from the fact that extended deterrence is not that easy to make credible, threatening to commit suicide. I think the Henry Kissinger quote was, great powers don't commit suicide on behalf of their allies. Aside from that, there would be major costs in terms of U.S. overextension in the Middle East, the political issues involved, given the continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict would be really tricky. U.S. relations with Turkey, even though it's in NATO, have really
Galen, I'm going to stop you right there. One way to make U.S. Commitment credible in the Middle East is by turning Gaza into the world's largest gated community, right?
Is this
what you find a point on?
Is this a gated community for like wealthy tourists, or is it the largest forward nuclear operating base in the world?
I'm not going to specify that. I'm not exactly sure who would want to live there and under what circumstances, but that's neither here nor there, right?
Oh man, what a time to be alive.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a lot to talk about, and there's a reason why our show is called Global Tantrum. Let's put it that way.
So this is all to say, I personally think it, and I think you do as well. I think it would be it would create a lot of real dangers and problems if Iran got the bomb.
Sure. Yeah. And the trickiest point in this type of situation is the point that we're at right now, before stable deterrence is established, before both sides have a second strike arsenal. That is to say, you cannot conduct a first strike against them and disarm them, right? You have to be worried about that second strike. Iran doesn't have that, and it's not going to get there for a while, even if they choose to go nuclear. And so this is a super dangerous time. They're on a knife's edge.
Especially since Israeli military doctrine, more or less since the birth of the state of Israel, stresses preemption and rapid
Yeah. Yeah. Preemptive war, preventive war, both of them. And so that might be what we're about to get. So let's talk about that. What might this look like? We're going to get Trump doing his thing at some point. Probably, if I had to guess, in the next couple months. So he's going to talk to the Iranians, apparently. We don't expect that to go very well, because he's going to do his thing. He's going to make maximalist demands. And we're seeing this actually against the Ukrainians, not against the Russians, against the Ukrainians right now in that conflict. Just a bunch of stuff on the table that like nobody was even thinking about.
Man,
Minerals,
want those
rare
minerals.
earths. Yes, on the Ukrainian shield. And we'll get back to that at some point. I don't want to think about it. But yeah, so he wants a new version of the JCPOA that includes ballistic missiles, that includes these proxies, that includes full normalization. Iran steps back from being a revolutionary state, an irredentist state, an expansionist state, and becomes just another Middle Eastern state, right? We're not trying to be the regional hegemon anymore. We're not interfering in everybody else's politics. We're not using genocidal rhetoric against Israel. We're not funding these proxies and terrorist groups.
We're not going to mess around as much in Iraq, maybe, where they essentially have turned it into a vassal state.
Right. Just like Lebanon has been, basically, and Syria's complicated. Anyway, so they would have to repudiate just the fundamental ideological underpinnings of their state, which is a revolutionary Islamic republic. It is founded upon exporting the Shia revolution. And that's what they've tried to do since inception. And they would have to quit all of that, probably.
And I do want to reiterate the difference between the Iranian government and the Iranian people. And
that's a really important point.
Going all the way back to the revolution, many Iranians were very disappointed with what they ended up getting.
Many Iranians left.
Yes, but I don't want to get too much into it because it'll take us. But it's an astonishing story of very strange set of bedfellows in opposition to the Shah, but not because they all wanted an Islamist theocracy.
Yeah.
And while I would argue that the revolutionary fervor, so to speak, has had moments where it's waxed and waned, fundamentally on the core issues at the level of the leadership, the supreme leader and his allies, I think that ideology continues to matter quite a bit. So what we're basically saying Trump wants to turn Iran into a different country. And yes, I don't know of many cases where that happens, though I will say, I don't know if it's ever been confirmed, but there are credible sources who reported back in 2003, after the United States took out Saddam Hussein, the Iranians were shaking in their boots that they were on the U.S. hit list, which I think they probably were had the U.S. not bogged down. By the way, is the explanation for why they paused their nuclear program at the time. They sent the U.S. essentially this kind of grand bargain that we're describing. It was, all right,
you guys win.
We're cool.
We also had 200,000 troops next door.
On both borders in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yes, and all sorts of naval assets in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And the Bush people basically told them to take a hike, which I think they would have liked that one back from the standpoint of 2025. But does suggest that, I'm sure this is the Israeli argument right now, if put under enough duress, or at least threatened credibly enough, maybe there is some prospect for that. My own view is that ship has sailed.
Maybe.
But
yeah, when you stack regime survival against the ideological goals and predilections of the regime, survival usually
Yeah,
wins.
there's just so much baggage now. There was
Yeah.
baggage then too, obviously.
There's credibility and trust issues for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like
Yeah.
Trump
So
tripping up the JCPOA, everyone said at the time, like, how are we supposed to ever be credible again in negotiation?
yeah, the thing about coercion is you make these threats to change somebody's behavior and they have to believe that you're going to hit them if they don't do it. They also have to believe that you're not going to hit them if they don't do it. There's two sides to the equation, and people forget that.
Correct.
And the Iranians may just not believe the Americans or the Israelis anymore, and I wouldn't blame them.
I was about to say, and you can't really blame.
You can't blame them. Yeah, especially Trump, who's, well, like in his case, he was very clear about what he thought about the deal. And this is a kind of unique characteristic.
Disaster. One of the worst deals that's ever been negotiated in history.
Yes. He had the invisible accordion really going on that one. But like when you're dealing with the United States, and this is one of the complaints against the United States international affairs, like you get a new version every 4 years, right? And now you're really getting a new version of the United States. And so everybody's just, holy crap.
Look, at the same time with him, I just never know. Like, he likes his steaks well done. If someone undercooks his steak, if he wakes up the next morning, I've had it with the fucking Israelis. We're doing a deal with the Iranians. I just never know.
You never know. It's a madman theory, right?
But I guess
leverage.
The question I want to ask you.
Yeah.
I remember a few years ago, I had Rachel Whitlar, who's a professor. I think she's still at Georgia Tech, out to talk about these issues. And she made the point, if you're the Israelis, like maybe you look at this as we did Osirok, we did Syria. Maybe we got lucky. Would we get lucky again? Or we're just really good at solving these problems? Is it possible? Like the doomsday scenarios you hear about in either a US or American strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, is this leads to a region-wide escalation. The Iranians fully take the gloves off. They start harassing traffic in the Persian Gulf. They have a capacity to stir up the restive Shia population in Saudi Arabia, which happens to be located where most of the oil is. They can certainly make life very difficult for the United States and its allies in Iraq. Now, some of its capabilities, particularly with Hezbollah, which was always seen as its ace in the hole, have been really degraded. So maybe those threats aren't as significant now. But I guess the question that I have for you is it comes down to essentially this question: do the risks of striking Iran's nuclear facilities outweigh the risks of living with a nuclear Iran?
Yeah, that's the right question to ask. It's the key question. I think the Israelis, I don't see how they couldn't be emboldened by the success that they've had recently against all these regional proxies.
Yeah.
But they want to hit the octopus in the head. I get it.
And by the way, like October 7th has complicated things with the Arab world for them because of the Palestinian issue, but no one is shedding a tear in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Jordan or Egypt over Iran's losses. They couldn't be happier that Iran is being put on the back foot.
Israel's done a lot of important security work for them. They would never say it openly, but there's no question about that. Now, the Israelis are really smart. They understand that going it alone would be pretty darn risky. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to do a half-assed job, right? Because then you get the worst of both worlds, right? You want to really get in there in one go and make sure you've done the job for quite a long time. You got to get all the centrifuges. You got to get all the scientists. You got to make it really hard to pick back up, like decades, if you ever even want to do it again. For that, it's a gamble, a big gamble, without the United States giving them these specialized MOABs. And I think the whole thing is going to boil down to that. Whether the United States opens up access, which would be unprecedented. They've never opened up access to anybody else. But they've already done, this administration has already done a lot for Israel, to put it mildly. And we know that Trump is not a fan of the Iranians, to put it mildly. And he's proven willing to tear up shibboleths of U.S. foreign policy. And if it means giving like a near nuclear bunker buster capability to Israel, he might do it.
So then this raises another question. One of the people I dislike more than anyone on planet Earth, John Bolton.
Yes. He of the walrus mustache.
Yes, former ambassador to the UN, and then
Hmm.
briefly under Bush, and then briefly Trump's national security advisor.
Briefly. Didn't work out between them.
Yes, and now he's a critic and just had his security detail removed by Trump. And
Yeah.
turns out, shocking, he decided to work with Trump and he burned you. I once saw a talk by him where he basically made the point, and this point I actually find to be an interesting one. If that's how it's going to go, why not just do it yourself if you're the United States?
Yeah. Why not?
You're gonna get blamed for it anyway.
Blamed for it, but you're putting the risks on a regional partner that is quite competent. I think the United States can trust Israelis if they get this hardware to do it correctly.
The IDF remains the premier fighting force on planet Earth in terms of
Pretty much.
qualitative factors.
Yeah, like per capita. I don't think there's any
Yes.
questions about that. And so I would turn that on its head and be like, why would we have to do it ourselves? Like, we've given you everything you need. I'm not putting American troops at risk. The thing is, though, on the other hand, American troops would be at risk in Middle Eastern bases everywhere, right?
Well, or it's not out of the question. I'm not talking about like an invasion or military strikes, but I don't think it's out of the question that Iran would support whatever you want to call it, or some sort of form of retaliation on American soil.
Yes. And we know that Hezbollah has operatives in the Western Hemisphere everywhere. And of course, I keep coming back to this. Our domestic security and intelligence apparatus is in the middle of a giant purge, which seems like poor timing. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, like if this were to move forward, I do think that the United States would be drawn in one way or another.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
it's
that's
very
right.
likely. And so then what do we have? We have some kind of sustained air campaign against the Iranians. What does that look like? They're trying to go nuclear while we're bombing them. We probably bomb them enough so that they can't do it, but they're going to pull out every other option they have. And the best way to hurt us, you already alluded to it, is to get the oil price up, because that would lead to higher inflation in the United States. And that seems to be everything politically. Now, the Trump administration is already
So
enacting.
can I,
Go ahead.
because so much of Iran's oil has already been taken off world markets though. So
It would not be their oil.
so you're talking about targeting other countries' oil installations.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And natural gas, right? They would make life hell.
And they've done that before
Yeah. They attacked Saudi's major refinery with drones.
in 2019, I think. Yeah.
Yes. And they conducted precision strikes that actually took some notable percentage of world refinement capability offline for a couple months.
They also, this is like back in 2012, which was partly in response to Stuxnet, the cyber attack that the US and Israel launched against the Natanz facility to destroy its uranium centrifuges. They attacked digital network in 2012 and wiped something like 35,000 computers.
Yeah. It would, all this to say, it would be a big mistake to think that the Iranians could not inflict pain on us and our allies.
Correct.
In response to some kind of air campaign. And they would do it. I don't think there's any question about that.
In retaliation for targeting the nuclear facilities, absolutely.
Yeah. You get energy prices spiking globally. You get a recession in the United States. You get political fallout. All this is bad for the Trump administration. Now, he's not up for election again. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he wants to get this done, right?
I mean, this could also escalate to a wider war in the region, conceivably.
Okay, what would that look like? Because
so
Israel is not invading Iran, right? We know that.
So that is the key question. I think that they could do some things with their asymmetric naval capabilities, but I think it would look more, Iran's bread and butter is asymmetric covert action, which I always make the point, if that's your bread and butter, a sign of weakness.
Yes, and manifestly, right?
You can't play at the main table. I think that they would really try to destabilize things in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
I think
there's some kind of Shia revolution in Saudi Arabia. I don't know what the percentages are like domestically there in terms of Shia versus Sunni.
I think it's 15% Shia. They're heavily located in the eastern province, which is where all the oil is.
Again, all of this points towards energy prices, right? Yeah. As the main coercive lever the Iranians actually have.
And terrorist attacks.
Yeah, terrorist attacks all over the place. Yeah. We haven't talked about terrorism too much in terms of the ability to coerce or deter people with terrorist attacks. The record is, shall we say, mixed.
Spotty.
Spotty. Yeah. And we can talk about that on another show at some point.
But I guess if we play that out, and I don't know what the scenario looks like exactly because I don't think anyone does,
Yeah.
but they have some success shutting down wide swaths of Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure.
Yeah.
Maybe you see bombs going off in Amman, Jordan, or in Cairo. I don't know. Maybe they start trying to do the same in Israel, although I kind of wonder if they're able to because they would have by now.
I don't know if you saw this news item. A bunch of buses just
Oh,
blew up
I did. And I don't know.
in
Do we
Israel.
who's responsible? Because I thought the reading was Hamas.
What was interesting about that was there was nobody on them and they weren't close to anybody. So to me, that reads as a warning.
And you also just sent me that article that Iran's had a lot more success than it used to in recruiting Israelis
Infiltrating.
as spies. Yeah.
Yeah. It used to be a one-way thing where Israel could just trivially infiltrate Iran because everybody's unhappy with the Iranian government. Turns out that's now a two-way thing because everybody in Israel is unhappy with, not everybody, but plenty of people are unhappy with the Israeli government, given the policies of the Netanyahu administration and the presence of extreme right wingers in his government. Like, not everybody in Israel is down for that, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
So,
and then if we're talking the United States, it's a target-rich environment.
It certainly is right now because we're in the middle of our own quasi-revolutionary changes, right?
So if we saw stuff like that, I guess that's what I mean. Then do we then see from the US or Israel or both, screw it, why don't we just do the whole thing? And why don't we try to take out the Iranian government?
Yeah, this moves from like a suppression campaign, air campaign to decapitation. Then you're asking, do you do it with US troops? That's something that Trump really doesn't want to do. And I actually believe that
I agree.
He would not want to do that. Are there rebel armies in sufficient numbers? And I forget exactly what the strategy is called. You have the MEK, those guys.
Mujahideen
al-Khalq. Yeah, al-Khalq.
Kind of, by the way, used to be listed as a terrorist organization by the United States during the Cold War. But since they don't like the current government, as the United States has done many times,
they're freedom fighters.
Flip them. Exactly. Yes.
Totally. Yeah, just as Syria's new president has really cleaned up nice when he puts on a suit.
Or after World War II, all of the Nazi scientists that knew how to build
Werner von
rockets.
Braun, famously.
Unit 731 in Japan, the guys that injected people in China with bubonic plague and did vivisection, but then the US wanted that data.
Yeah, you guys are cool. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if it's not going to be US troops, it's not going to be Israeli troops. So you'd need some kind of faction inside of Iran to do it.
But what about like a bombing campaign, like a
decapitation? That shit doesn't work. Like,
yeah, and the other thing about this, which I don't want to overrate the argument. I've seen people use this as like the ultimate, I hate you. He's ruined the term, but the ultimate trump card, that you do something like bombing Iran's nuclear sites would probably do it. But if you're targeting civilian sites, it will be much more difficult, if not impossible, to leverage your ordinary Iranians' dissatisfaction with the government. It's likely to lead to a rally around the flag effect.
We have not had amazing results with regime change policies in the recent past in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And Trump ran on those failures the first time. And he called the people responsible for those policies the dumbest people on the face of the earth. Or maybe that was Tommy Franks. I think I'm misattributing. But he basically picked that up and ran with it, and it worked against the Bushes and Jeb Bush, because he was tarred with that same brush. Are we really going to go down that road? I don't think so. So
low energy Jeb.
Low energy. Yeah. I was never a fan of Trump at any point in time, and I still am not, but his insult game has always been on point.
Ron DeSanctimonious.
Not bad. Meatball Ron.
And I mean, then there's like, look, man, I hate it, but I'll give you the point. Like the unintentional humor sometimes, like after the US killed Baghdadi, he died like a dog.
He's got good timing. Yeah. Credit where credit is due.
Yeah. But this is where, and I have always been on this, like a don't do it guy. To me, the question somewhat hinges on what can the Iranians do in retaliation? And is that worth the cost of keeping them non-nuclear? The other part of it we haven't talked about yet is the Iranians could rebuild their infrastructure. And the estimates I've seen were always like they could probably do it in 3 years.
But now you're doing it under the auspices of like a state of war,
Yeah.
right? And you got to find new places to do it. You got to try to keep it secret under a sustained bombing campaign. And we went down this road with, what was it, Desert Fox, and Clinton bombed.
Desert Fox was the strikes on Iraq in 1998,
That's right.
December 98, which I think they probably didn't realize they were naming an operation after a famous Nazi general.
Oops. That being Rommel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad. I didn't even think about that. I didn't realize it. Yeah, the Desert Fox, yes. Africa Corps.
Correct.
Anyway, yeah, I think it becomes a lot more difficult under those circumstances to reconstitute a program and get any kind of nuclear weapon together. I think with the Israelis and the United States bombing at the same time, particularly if the Russians are not, or the Chinese are not stepping in to help actively, which they're not going to do, especially given the Trump's new policies towards Russia. And we talked a little bit about this before the show. It's maybe these things are linked in Trump's mind. It's like, we're about to do Iran. I'm going to give you Ukraine. I need you to like give us Iran.
Even if that weren't the case, I think Putin has his hands full.
Yeah.
And isn't fight a war on behalf of Iran.
You're staring down the barrel of being like Saddam in the 90s. If you're the Iranians, so it's a pariah state internationally. You're getting bombed sporadically. Can't really do anything
under tough sanctions.
Yeah.
Now, one difference is I think Saddam in the 90s was relatively more isolated.
I think that would be the case. Yeah, because
Iran
we have much less support, right?
Yeah, Iran does have connections to Russia and China.
Is how the Europeans would react to all of this.
Yeah. Oh, they would not react well.
No,
and then
not.
The other thing is Iran is a much bigger and at least potentially more powerful country than Iraq is.
Also true. Yeah.
But like massively larger land mass and something like 3 or 4 times as large a population.
Maybe the prospect of this type of disaster, this extended disaster that we're talking about, causes everybody to take a step back at the last minute. I do think it's all going to play out this year, certainly.
Yeah, that's right.
It could be within the next couple of months. It could be later this year, but it's going to happen pretty soon.
Which is so wild because this has been like the eternal question mark looming over like everything that people that like you and I study. This has just been a constant, like, when's that?
I've noticed a pattern. I've noticed a pattern in the era of global tantrum, which was kicked off by the second Trump administration. A lot of the question marks are starting to get resolved.
That's
and not necessarily in ways that you or I agree with, but it is the case. Like, we wanted to know what's going on with NATO for decades. Now we know what's going on with NATO. It's not looking too good. We wanted to know what's going on in East Asia. Like, that one, we don't know yet.
That one, yeah. But Israel, Palestine.
Yep.
Again,
2 state versus 1 state.
Not necessarily liking what I'm seeing, but it does appear to be that there are going to be important developments.
Yeah, the question marks are getting resolved into exclamation points, and it's like a series of Band-Aid rips is one way you could think about it. And again, we don't necessarily agree with what's under the Band-Aid, but it's like in Israel, Palestine, we've been slouching toward a 1-state solution for quite a while now. In our shows on Gaza, we talked about that quite extensively. And now it's just like, all right, let's just do this shit. Same thing in Europe. NATO's been criticized for decades now, and the Americans have tried to get the Europeans to pay more, and we're trying to pivot to Asia. It's like, all right, all of this belongs to you now. And it's just one after the other. It's just like, in East Asia is the biggest and maybe the most important, because that's where everybody has said, Trump himself and Hegseth and his people have been like, this is where the action is.
Yeah.
This is where the United States is going to be. So what is that going to look like?
Although, we'll definitely do an episode on this. Trump has been much less, if you're Taiwanese, a lot less reassuring.
You're not wrong about
than
that.
Biden was.
Yeah, my good friend, Chairman Xi Jinping, right? He wants to be buddies with Xi too. Like he's got bro envy between Putin and Xi.
I just want to double check this. So I want to make sure it's right. My favorite one was like when he called Sisi his favorite dictator. Yeah, where's my favorite dictator? Yeah.
Where are you at? Is he in the audience somewhere? It's like the Grammys or something.
Yeah, like So I guess then, since we've been talking around it for a while, what's your prediction? Do you think we're going to see airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites this year, whether
Yeah,
by Israel or the United States?
50-50. That's not a satisfying answer.
I'm I understand why you're saying it.
Yeah.
I'm equally torn. I'm gonna say no with
Okay.
a very low degree of confidence.
So 60-40. No.
Look, I'm like right around where you are, but just like
Yeah.
because I need to have a bottom line, I'm gonna say no. I'm going to bank on Trump really doesn't have to get involved in a conflict in the Middle East.
He's already doing a bunch of inflationary shit with the trade stuff, man. And if he's going to do this, he needs to be ready with like other energy supply, either from the US or from Canada or for somebody. And we've alienated the Canadians. So you can't, at a certain point, reality intervenes.
Again, I'm not saying it with a high degree of confidence, but I'd say on balance, I think that's, at least for this year, what we're gonna see.
Okay. So some
But
kind of temporizing, some kind of
yeah,
interim agreement.
I don't think anything's gonna get resolved. Like, I think that ship has sailed. So I think the question's going to be resolved one way or another. We're either gonna have a nuclear Iran or we're gonna have military force. I just don't see the Iranians completely capitulating at the diplomatic table, even
Okay.
if the nuclear program is like siloed off from their broader behavior in the region. I don't see them giving up the entirety of their nuclear program.
Yeah. The civilian stuff, right? Which is significant and
So
important.
and the nuclear program, that is popular in Iran. It's like a cause
Absolutely.
of national pride.
Yeah, it's cheap carbon-free electricity. They need it and we all need it. And we should support that, but we have to be able to trust them not to turn around and turn that stuff into nuclear weapons.
Hey, worth noting, by the way, the Iranians got their first reactor, I believe, from the United States under the Shah
Pretty funny.
under the Atoms for Peace program. So there
Yeah,
you go.
atoms for peace. Eisenhower. Yeah, here's the thing. If the Israelis do not get the Moabs, I do not think there will be any kind of strike or military campaign against the Iranians. And the Iranians do not need to cross the nuclear threshold
It would be very
either.
costly. Look, they would get the
Yeah.
ultimate deterrent, but there would be risks, as you said, during they're establishing a secure second, if they're able to do that, worth emphasizing. And even if they did, it generally doesn't work out well for countries, whether this is fair or not, when they cross the United States on proliferation issues. Like the United States will make sure your life sucks for all of
Yeah, it'll be
eternity.
bad. On the other hand, we have some counterexamples, Gaddafi in Libya, right?
That's true, but he gave up his program and then we killed him.
Yes, exactly. He ended up dead in a ditch, literally, like Mussolini style almost. Not a good way to go.
And the North Koreans, now, whether they're just using this for propaganda purposes, but I don't think it's an unreasonable argument. The North Koreans love pointing to that example. Oh,
Right.
you want us to give up the bomb?
Yeah, look how well that worked out in Libya. Totally. And they're too far gone. Like they're very
Oh yeah,
established at
that's a
this
different
point.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, completely different. And yeah, I don't know. It comes down to the Moabs. And it could be that the accommodation is as simple as you don't give the Israelis the Moabs, we will not cross the line. And like literally nothing else gets settled, right?
And this gets to a point you made last week. This is an administration where the boss man really is the only one who matters. So
Correct.
ordinarily, I'd be having thoughts of, okay, Rubio is the Secretary of State, neocon hawk. I could see him supporting it. He's been very hawkish, although now that he actually has to be responsible for saying these things, maybe it's a little different. But there are hawks within the administration on Iran. At the end of the day, I think Trump is so averse, even if the risks are not as big as some people make them out to be, to getting involved or sparking a major conflict in the Middle East, that he's going to be reluctant to approve that sale. And I don't
Yeah.
think he's going to do it on his own. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Fair enough. And I think that would be the best outcome for everybody,
Although
honestly.
it doesn't resolve the issue.
It doesn't resolve the issue, but it's like it prevents the Israelis from maybe going a bridge too far
Yeah.
and causing like solving one problem but creating many others.
What our former professor John Mearsheimer likes to refer to as the victory disease.
Yes,
Uh,
you've mentioned that. It's a
yeah.
real thing.
Yeah. So
Anyway, let's leave it there for this
yeah.
week. That was a
Sounds
fun
good.
one.
Yeah, man.
Right.
And good luck to your guys tonight.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm gonna be sinking those trees. So
Right on.
awesome. All right,
All right,
later.
man. Till next time.
Till next time.